Good evening, and welcome to the penultimate event this term at the Oxford University Scientific Society. Today, we have the luck to hear from Dr. Jo Marchant. Her book, The Human Cosmos, has been compared with Sapiens by Professor Yuval Harari and chosen by the Economist magazine as the best book of 2020. If you have questions for our speaker, please write them in the comments section and we'll be collecting them as the talk goes along. Dr. Marchant, I look forward to your fascinating talk. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you, Luna, for that lovely introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you about our changing relationship with the stars. So I'm just going to start my presentation. So hopefully you can see the slide in place there. So what I want to talk about tonight is something that is so powerful that just looking at it, in fact, just looking at a picture of it can make us more creative, more curious, happier, less stressed. It can make people more generous, make you feel more connected to other people. It can even make you feel as if you have more time. And all of this is what psychologists have found for the stars. The starry sky is one of the most powerful sources that we have of the emotion of awe. So that's the feeling that you get when you're confronted by something vast that dwarfs you, that's beyond your capacity to comprehend it. When psychologists want to study awe, often they just show people the stars, and they've found all those improvements in well-being that I just mentioned, but they've also found that awe really changes people's outlook on life. So after feeling awe, people make more ethical decisions. They're more likely to make sacrifices to help other people. They care less about money and more about the planet. And yet, just as we're realizing how important this view is, we're losing it. Every society through history has been inspired by the sight of the spectacular heavens until now. Now, because of artificial light pollution, instead of thousands of stars in the sky, we see just a few dozen in today's cities. Even on a clear night, 80% of us can no longer see the Milky Way, our own galaxy, at all. And so that is really why I wanted to write my book, The Human Cosmos. I wanted to know what we're losing. So how has that view of the starry skies been important through history? And is it still important? Does it still matter now? So in the book, I look at how our view of the stars has shaped pretty much every aspect of human civilization, from our religion to our politics to our art. I'm particularly interested in how we've built our scientific understanding of the universe, but also how at the same time we've separated ourselves physically and emotionally from the stars to the point where soon we may not be able to see them at all. So the book, I divided it into 12 chapters. Each one sort of looks at a different moment in history and explores a different way in which the stars have inspired human civilization, especially Western civilization, and also helps to show how we've gradually separated ourselves from the stars. So tonight I'm just going to dip into a few of those stories before coming back at the end to that idea of awe. So let's start at the beginning, and we're going to go right back to the Paleolithic era, looking at how our very earliest ancestors looked to the cosmos, what they thought about the stars. And in particular, we're going to go to Lascaux Cave in France, which has these beautiful cave paintings. They're around 20,000 years old, and they're these animals, oryx bulls, horses, stags, sort of floating across the walls and the ceiling of this cave. And there's one painting in particular that's really interesting, I think. It's this one. It's called Bull number 18. It's the largest oryx bull in the cave, more than 5 meters long. And it has this really interesting pattern of dots just above its shoulder. So you've got this line of 4 and 2 dots, which is quite characteristic. And what's intriguing about that is that you see that same pattern of dots recurring in art around the planet and through history. So the Lascaux dots are on the bottom left here, but you've got other examples from Native American art, which are the other two images on the bottom row. You see it in the art of shamans in Siberia, that's the middle top image, and even slightly adapted in the logo of the Japanese car maker Subaru. And all of these other four examples are representations of a star cluster, the Pleiades, which is on the top left here. So that has raised the question, well, could that be what these dots are showing in Lascaux Cave as well? You know, could these artists 20,000 years ago have been painting the stars? And what makes the comparison even more interesting is where they're positioned at the shoulder of a bull, because the Pleiades star cluster are right at the shoulder of our modern constellation Taurus, the bull. And if you put them next to each other, it's really quite striking, the similarity. You've got those four pointing horns defined by stars at the tips. There's the eye, which is the prominent star Aldebaran, the cluster, that sort of speckle of the Hyades star cluster on the face, and then the Pleiades at the shoulder. So could these artists of the Paleolithic not just have been painting animals, but also painting the stars? Why would they have wanted to do that? Is it even possible that the stories that they were telling about the stars then still survive now? And it's really hard to answer any of those questions sort of for sure, but there's some really interesting evidence that we can use to kind of build an idea of what these artists might have been thinking. There is work showing that myths that we now tell about the stars, some of those do date back to the Paleolithic. That's from researchers sort of comparing different versions of myths around the planet and building family trees. Another way of looking at this is that anthropologists can look at what more recent hunter-gatherer communities think and believe about the stars. People who had sort of lifestyles perhaps of similar complexity, how the Paleolithic people might have lived. One is recently California. And what you see almost kinds of communities is that the cosmos is absolutely central to their lives. So this celestial bodies and the sky, it features in their art, opening the cosmos, their spiritual and religious beliefs, different rituals. It's all revolving around what's going on in the sky. And the reason for that is really that what's in the sky is the rival. So if you think about, the sun is, as example, rising and setting for the day, and the night determining the seasons through the year. So it's the sun's determining whether the environment on Earth is light or dark, warm or cold, whether life is thriving or lying dormant. You've got moonlight as well, which is determining things like hunting during the night, also regulating reproduction in a lot of species on Earth, but the stars as well. So because of the Earth's rotation, the stars are circling through the sky each night around the celestial poles, so the points directly above the North and South Pole on the Earth. So you've got that circling giving you a sense of time through the night, a sense of direction, which way you're facing relative to the stars, but also through the year as well. As the Earth moves around the sun, different star constellations become visible at different times of year. So different stars become associated with different changes in the natural world. And a lot of hunter-gatherer communities have calendars that are based on these different star constellations or what's happening with the moon. To take an example that's relevant for our example of the bull, the Native American Blackfoot people traditionally associated the visibility of the Pleiades star with the life cycle of the bison, which they hunted. So when the Pleiades set, for example, it was time to hunt. So one idea is that something similar to this might have been going on in the Paleolithic, that so one astronomer calculated that back at the time that this bull was painted, the visibility of the Pleiades would have correlated quite well with the life cycle of the Oryx bull, which was really important to the people of Lascaux. And so perhaps in the same way as the Blackfoot, they came to associate those stars with a bull, and it wouldn't have been a great leap then to associate the stars with a sort of bull in the sky. And we can't know for sure that this is what was happening with this bull, but overall, the picture that we get from all the different pieces of evidence that you can draw in is that the sort of our earliest ancestors would have had a very holistic view of the sky. They didn't really differentiate between themselves and nature, between earth and sky. everything was changing, the stars in the sky, the natural changes on Earth. It was all part of one interconnected system. And the story since has really been about how we've gradually separated ourselves out from that holistic, interconnected cosmos and built that objective understanding of science. So when did we take that first step away from nature? And so to look at that, we're going to take a brief stop in Turkey. This is a fascinating site called Göbekli Tepe, which was built in the 10th millennium BC. So 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It's one of, or if not the sort of earliest sort of monumental stone site that we know. And it's at a really interesting point in space and time because it's located just at the boundary between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. So this was built just before that really crucial invention of farming, of agriculture, when people started to exploit and control the species around them. And it's also at exactly the place on the planet where farming was about to arise. And you can see that you've got these stone sort of circular enclosures that are dug down into the ground. There's benches around the edge, these T-shaped pillars around the edge, and then two more larger T-shaped pillars in the middle. They're really big, more than 5 meters high. And you can see from the carving, so on these pillars, they've got belts and arms and necklaces, loincloths. So it seems like they were intended as some kind of human-like figures. One of them you can see on the right here has got a symbol like a disc and a crescent that's been suggested to represent the moon. And one idea about what this site was used for is that it was meant as some kind of star observatory that people were, it's located on a hilltop, would have had a great view of the sky. Maybe people were using the flat tops of these pillars to sight different stars. Actually, that is quite unlikely. The archaeologists working here think that these circles were dug down into the ground. They probably even had roofs over. But it seems that the site was still absolutely about how people saw their cosmos, how they related to it. For one thing, there's a real obsession with death here. The archaeologists have excavated lots of skulls from these enclosures that seem to have been hung up for display inside. And you couldn't just walk in through a door, you had to crawl in through a little porthole. These were surrounded by sort of scary carvings, things like animals dead on their backs. There were lots of sort of animals that were either poisonous or dangerous. And the archaeologists think that these enclosures represented portals to the underworld, to the cosmic realm of the dead, and that these pillars represented some kind of transcendent beings, maybe sort of human ancestors that you would meet when you went into this scary realm. So what this site seems to represent is a really interesting change in people's relationship with their environment, with their cosmos. So first of all, you've got a sort of move from animals in the sky to human ancestors. So with Lascaux and other caves in the Paleolithic, it's all animal paintings. That there are very few human figures. But now it's these human figures, human ancestors that's dominant. So that seems to represent some kind of split away from nature, people seeing themselves as raised above the rest of nature. And then there's the fact that people are really controlling and exploiting their environment. They're now, rather than just living in caves, they're changing the landscape. They're building their own portals to other cosmic realms. So this seems to represent a kind of really important change in mindset just ahead of that invention of farming. So people talk about possible environmental factors that might have led to farming, but there's an increasing idea that actually there needed to be a change in mindset as well, that sort of technologically people could have started farming way before this, but that there needed to be something happening in how they related to nature and their environment. And then this may represent that of people raising themselves above nature. And it was that mindset then that then it made farming sort of conceivable, which has then led to all of the technological progress that's happened since then that has so defined our species. So we're going to jump ahead now to some of the first written records of what people thought about the cosmos and the stars. And we're going to look in particular at the birth of an idea that has been really influential through human history, which is that our fate is somehow written in the stars. So we're going to talk about the Babylonians who lived in ancient Mesopotamia from the 3rd millennium BC. And their clay tablets are some of the very earliest written records that we have. Thousands of these tablets. They're a wonderful insight into sort of what people believed and thought at the time, and they reveal, above all, really, an absolute obsession with what was going on in the sky. They still had this holistic view of the cosmos, that things on the sky, sort of happening in the sky, are affecting what's happening on Earth, but they really took it to extremes. For the Babylonians, everything that happened in the sky could be a planet changing direction, a lunar eclipse. These were all seen as omens, kind of warnings from the gods about terrible things that were going to happen on Earth, famine or attack. These are a couple of examples on the screen of different omens that have been found on these tablets. One celestial event that was seen as particularly important, significant, was a lunar eclipse that was often seen as foretelling the death of the king. And if you knew what these omens were, they were particular rituals that they could enact that would sort of dispel the evil, stop the bad thing from happening. And so the king at the time would have teams of astronomers who would be watching the sky every night, noting down what was happening, letting him know of any omens that he needed to be aware of, and what rituals needed to be carried out to sort of avert them. This is a view of what Babylon may have looked like around the 6th century BC. And that tower right at the back there, that's the tower, they called it a Temenanki, the gateway between heaven and earth, and the priest would make their observations each night from the top of that tower. And this tower was immortalized in the Bible as the Tower of Babel. But this, what it was actually for was for the priests to make their observations of the sky. And they did this over centuries. And because they were so meticulously noting down what was happening in the sky over such a long period of time, they started to recognize patterns, particularly like repeating patterns in cycles of different kinds of events. So even things like subtle variations in the speed of the sun or the moon that you would really struggle to notice with the naked eye, or the wandering path of the planets, which seem quite erratic at first. They started to realize that these repeat. The path of Venus, for example, repeats every 8 years. Patterns of eclipses repeat every 18 years. So they could start to sort of predict in advance when different events were going to happen. And then around 400 BC, they came up with an invention that made them even more powerful, which was the zodiac. So they took the circle, the path of the sun against the background stars through the year. And they took that 360-degree circle and divided it into 12 segments of 30 degrees each, and named each one after a nearby constellation. And that is the origin of the zodiac that we have today. We don't have all of the same signs that they had, but some of them have survived until now, including Taurus. And we associate that with astrology. But the reason that the priests came up with this system is interesting, because the reason they did it was actually so that they could have an accurate coordinate system or scale in the sky. So when they were writing down the location of a particular event in the sky, like a planet changing direction, they could write it down like much more precisely to the degree where that thing happened. And that made their observations a lot more accurate. And they were able from there to develop really quite sophisticated mathematical models describing the changing motion of different celestial bodies in the sky. So any particular day in the future, they could say where that celestial body was going to be. So that, I think, is a really crucial moment in human history, because they were the first people to use mathematics to model the sky, the universe. They started with this very magical thinking, these omens, but that belief kind of drove them to this very accurate way of observing and describing what was happening. They were moving from a qualitative cosmos to a quantitative one, if you like. So there's a lot of the origins of astrology lie with the Babylonians, but they also took a sort of crucial first step with this mathematical approach towards the scientific astronomy and a mathematical way of studying the universe that has been so important ever since. So we started with a holistic cosmos, no split really between humans and nature, earth and sky. We had that first split away from nature with the birth of farming. We've looked at the first people to use numbers to make sense of the sky, So now I want to look at how we invented our modern sense of time. So this is Richard of Wallingford. He was the abbot of the monastery in St Albans in the 14th century AD. He had leprosy, in case you're wondering what was going on with his face. But he also created a spectacular invention, and he's pointing to it here. It was a huge celestial clock that was installed high on the wall of the abbey's church, and it was really ahead of its time. 200 years later, a witness saw it and described it as a marvel still without equal in all of Europe. And unfortunately, the clock itself doesn't survive, but we do have Richard's instructions for building it, which are held in Oxford, actually. And this is his instructions, and this is the very earliest written description we have of any mechanical clock. And so I want to tell a little bit about its story, because it's not just a sort of incredible invention in itself, but this also symbolizes another sort of key moment in human history, which is when we took time out of the cosmos. So what do I mean by took time out of the cosmos? Well, today we tend to have a sort of idea, a sense, a concept of time as something that sort of just ticks by on its own. It's nothing particularly to do with the sky. It's just something that we can count, that we can measure with our clocks. But it hasn't always been that way. So through most of human history, time was absolutely bound up with the movements of the cosmos, with the sun, the moon, the stars, their cycles through the sky. And there are still people living today who have that sense of time. Societies in the Amazon rainforest, for example, who have no concept of abstract time, no word even for time. There were only the sort of changing events that they experience in the universe around them. And it was the monks of medieval Europe who were really responsible for changing our ideas about time. So they became sort of more and more concerned with the accuracy of the timing of their prayers. They had more and more sort of rounds of prayer during the day that they had to, and they wanted to time that very accurately, because they thought that that would increase the sort of the power, the spiritual power of their prayers if they're praying on time and they're all praying together. So they became very concerned with timekeeping. We know by the 10th and or 11th centuries they had water clocks that rang bells, and then by the end of the 13th century you see the very first mechanical clocks that appeared in churches in England. And as I said, Richard of Wallingford's clock, this is the earliest one that we have a description of. And this is a picture of the bit of the mechanism, the sort of crucial part that made mechanical clocks possible and really changed our sense of time. This is the escapement. So clocks up until this point, whether it was water clocks, sand timers, burning candles, they're all based on different kinds of continuous flow. And it makes intuitive sense. Time seems to flow continuously. But the problem with these kinds of processes is it's very hard to get them to run at a constant speed. And the medieval monks, they were experimenting with sort of geared mechanisms like clockwork, gear wheels, driven by a falling weight that was sort of on the end of a rope or a chain. And they had the same problem. The weights accelerated as they fell to the ground. And so the escapement is the little semicircular bit near the top of this picture, and it rocks backwards and forwards, and it alternately blocks and releases the motion of that turning gear wheel. And so you've sliced up its motion. It's now moving in regular chunks, and that controls that falling weight and allows that motion to happen at a constant speed. So it made mechanical clocks possible, but it's also, you've essentially sliced up that continuous flow of time. You've created those, the beats or ticks of the clock. So we've gone there from a sort of qualitative flow of time into a quantitative view of time, something mathematical that you can count. And what Richard did with his technology was interesting as well, because he didn't just build a simple timepiece or clock. He built this grand celestial model of the universe, essentially. These are a couple of reconstructions of what it might have looked like. We know it had this big iron display dial, 6 feet across, that had a map of the sky on it that turned in time with the stars. There was a bell that rang every hour. a pointer that moved with the varying speed of the sun, another pointer for the moon that had a little black and white ball that rotated to show you the phase of the moon. This clock also showed the movements of the planets, the timing of lunar eclipses, even the rise and fall of the tide at St Albans nearest port, which was London Bridge. So for Richard, time was still absolutely bound up with the cosmos, the universe. He couldn't really conceive of having time passing without that. And he devoted pretty much his entire working life and almost all of the Abbey's funds into building this device. But he was absolutely right about the importance of the technology, because after that, these celestial clocks just spread really quickly all throughout Europe. They started appearing not just in churches, but in marketplaces, these beautiful celestial displays showing the sun, the moon, the planets, eclipses. And very quickly, they started controlling people's lives, people's daily lives, their work shifts, for example, when work starts and finishes, market trading hours, everything about people's lives was now being controlled not by the church so much, but by the striking of the hours of these clocks. And historians now see clocks as really a key technological development that laid the groundwork for secularization, capitalism, industrial revolution, really all of the sort of beginnings of the sort of economic age that we live in now. But over time, as clocks became more accurate, they eventually became more accurate than the sun. They were able to run at a sort of more constant speed than the sun does in the sky. And as that happened, they were no longer seen as models of the cosmos. They kind of transcended the universe, if you like. Those astronomical displays were dropped, and clocks became more about just a timepiece, measuring this sort of abstract time. And we now think of time not as something bound up with the sky, but as a sort of as a mathematical abstract quantity, almost more like money. It's something that we count, buy, spend, waste, save. So it's now just something that is measured by our increasingly accurate clocks. So I want to talk next about power. So our beliefs about the cosmos and how it works have always governed how we live on Earth. And that is something that is just as true today in terms of determining who gets to be in charge and why as it has ever been. So if you look back to more ancient civilizations, rulers almost invariably were taking divine authority from the heavens. So here we've got the Roman Emperor Claudius showing himself as the planet Jupiter, the ancient Chinese Emperor Wu, who called himself the son of heaven, the Egyptian Pharaoh Akhenaten, who claimed to be the son of the sun, and more recently the French King Louis XIV, again shown here as the sun. So they're all using that sort of authority, the heavens, to cement their own status. And that works really well. It's really hard to question someone's authority if it's drawn from just how the universe works. But as we've built a more scientific understanding of the universe, that in turn has fed into our political structures. So Isaac Newton really revolutionized things with his laws of motion and gravitation. So he really changed physics with the idea that there are universal mathematical laws that govern the motion of everything in the cosmos, from particles to planets. And that was important because it meant that celestial bodies are no longer sort of divine beings who can move at their own whim through the universe. That they have to obey the same mathematical rules as everything else. And that got people thinking, well, if that is true for the cosmos, then shouldn't that be true for people as well? Like, shouldn't everybody from commoners to kings have to obey the same rules? And these ideas were really important, feeding into discussions about democracy and human rights. So into the Enlightenment, through the 18th century, people were talking about these issues, used a lot of astronomical and mechanical imagery. They were drawing on Newton's ideas. So people like Lord Bolingbroke and Montesquieu, they're talking here about the importance of the government in England as a sort of check on the power of the king. And they're using ideas about orbits and gravitation. People were really interested in the balance of power. So Newton talked about the balance of forces in planetary orbits, so between the balance between the centrifugal and centripetal force that kept planets stable, and people were interested in whether you could replicate that in a society. So if your gravitational force was too strong, you'd end up with a draconian dictatorship, everything kind of being crushed in towards the central sun. But if the gravitational ties were too loose, then everyone would sort of hurtle away into anarchy and chaos. So how could you get the most stable society, the most perfect balance between the two? And these ideas were also popular among revolutionaries at the time in America and France. One of the most influential people calling for independence in America was Thomas Paine. So he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which really tipped the balance of popular opinion in favor of independence. He said, "In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet, and as England and America with respect to each other reverse the common order of nature, it's evident that they belong to different systems." The primary planet there, he means the sun. So he's essentially using an argument from Newtonian physics to argue that America should be independent. And then even after the revolution, when the founders of the new United States were talking about how they were going to build their new government, their new democracy, they had different ideas about how tightly controlled the states should be by the federal government. So whether the states should be left to move freely in their orbits, or whether their attractions and repulsions should be controlled. But everyone is now talking in this new Newtonian framework. This is no longer about a ruler having a divine right to rule. This is about societies and governments having to follow logic and physical laws. And there's one more detail about this story which I love, which is that before the revolution, sort of the metaphor that people used to describe America, it was seen as a planet orbiting the central sun of England. But then after independence, that meant they needed a new metaphor. They couldn't just be a planet sort of drifting on its own in space. And so they came up with the idea of a constellation of stars. What a correspondent in one newspaper at the time talked about a constellation founded upon the principles of perfect equality, a republic amidst the stars, which I think is a really lovely image. And it also meant that when these founders were trying to come up with a new flag for their new democracy, there was only one way that they could represent the states, of course, as a constellation of equal stars in the sky. So I want to tell one more story about light. And so light it's really the main source of information that we have about the wider cosmos, is the light that reaches us on Earth. For most of human history, it's been basically the only source of information that we had about the heavens, about the sky. And so this is a story about how we've changed what we do with that light. So this is William and Mary Huggins. They were husband and wife astronomers in the 19th century. And they lived just around the corner from where I am now, actually, Tulse Hill in South London. And they had a telescope, in fact, a whole observatory in their back garden. And before he married Mary, William had this telescope. He used it to sketch the planets, observe the stars, but he was feeling pretty dissatisfied with that. He wanted more from his astronomy. And then one evening in 1862, he attended a lecture which changed his life. This lecture was about work that had just been carried out in Germany by the chemist Robert Bunsen, who's famous for inventing the Bunsen burner, and the physicist Gustav Kirchhoff. Bunsen and Kirchhoff were interested in a phenomenon which you may be familiar with, where different substances are burned in a flame. They burn with different colours. And these two were interested, they wanted to sort of try and work out, well, why is that? What's causing the different colours? And so rather than just analysing or looking at the colours by eye, and saying, well, that flame's green, that one's greenish blue, they came up with a spectroscope to sort of analyse it more precisely. So you can see the Bunsen burner is labelled D on the right here. You've got the sample being held in the flame. And then the light is going through a little telescope and then being split using a prism into a spectrum. And then that spectrum is going through the second telescope where they were analysing it. So it's no longer just analysing the colour by eye, but you can actually look for the presence and absence of all the different frequency lines in the spectrum. So you've gone from a qualitative way of analysing this to a quantitative one. You count those different bands. And This lecture that Huggins went to was mostly about how you could use this technique to analyze different samples in the lab. Bunsen and Kirchhoff showed that you could use characteristic patterns in the spectral lines to identify different elements. But the lecture also mentioned that they'd used their spectroscope to analyze sunlight, and they'd shown that some of the same elements, chemical elements that we have on Earth, are also present in the sun. And that might not sound so surprising today, but at the time it was absolutely revolutionary, because it was just seen as dogma at the time that although scientists could describe the appearance of celestial bodies or their motion in the sky, they would never be able to know their chemical composition. They're just too far away. We can't get a sample of them. That is just something that is outside of the realm of science, not even worth speculating about. And here, Bunsen and Kirchhoff showed that it was possible to show the composition of the sun just from the secrets that were hidden in its light. And Huggins was captivated by this. He wrote later that he felt as if he'd been given a key to unlocking a door that had been regarded as forever closed to man. So he immediately set about changing or converting his observatory into something more like a chemistry lab with batteries and Bunsen burners and different chemical samples. And he fitted a prism to the end of his telescope and used it to analyze starlight. So he was splitting the starlight into a spectrum and then comparing the presence and absence of different frequency lines with the lines he was getting from burning different chemical elements in the lab. And he was able to show that the same elements, although there was differences between different stars, overall it's the same chemical elements that we have on Earth are also in the stars. So that same chemistry is extending not just across the solar system, but across the universe. And then later, after he married Mary, the pair of them worked together to photograph the spectra of hundreds of different stars and planets. And in 1899, they published a grand atlas of star spectra. And from the comparisons of these different spectra, they speculated about how stars might evolve as they burned fuel through their lives, and about how new generations of stars might emerge from the exploded remains of the old. And so this was an epic vision of a dynamic, evolving universe that was quite different from anything that had been seen before that point. And it was all from the secrets encoded in the light. And that was really the birth of the field of astrophysics. So now we have mind-bogglingly powerful telescopes that analyze not just visible light, but all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this field that the Hugginses helped to start has really shaken human culture, because all the myths that we had about what the celestial bodies are, where the universe comes from, they've been replaced now by scientific, evidence-based stories. So using star spectra, physicists have been able to show that nearly every atom in our bodies was forged inside stars. They've been able to look at the life cycles of stars, and from that to discover completely new kinds of celestial objects that had never been speculated about before. So neutron stars, black holes, supernovae. From looking at the Doppler shift in spectra, so when a light from is coming from a moving source, it can get shifted to the red or blue end of the spectrum. That effect is what first told astrophysicists that galaxies are moving away from us in every direction. The universe is expanding, and that led to the idea of the universe starting in this big bang. So now we have a sort of scientific, evidence-based creation story for the universe. So we understand more now about the universe, how it works, what it is, than ever before. But there is also an irony there, because in a way, this field, these techniques have contributed to our separation from the universe, because nobody actually looks through these telescopes. The light is picked up by electronic detectors and analyzed by computer. So this is one more shift away from sort of personal experience of the stars and the sky towards measurement and calculation. So our understanding and knowledge about the universe is now coming not from our experience or our eyes, but from our increasingly accurate technology and instruments. And in everyday life as well, from a practical point of view, there's sort of technology is sort of it's sort of separating us from the sky. So, now we have artificial lighting and heating, so we don't need to pay any attention to cosmic cycles in how we live during different seasons. We've got clocks and GPS that tell us when and where we are. Most of our entertainment now comes from screens. And so we've got this amazing sort of convenience and freedom from all of this technology. We no longer need to look at the sky. But scientists are starting to realize that actually there are also some downsides to this physical separation. So neuroscientists have looked at the effect on the brain of using sat-nav systems to navigate, for example, and found that when we use GPS or sat-nav, bits of the brain that are involved in sort of paying attention to our environment actually sort of shut down over time. You even see structural changes in the brain, so people become less able to navigate for themselves. We start making stupid mistakes because we're too focused on screens rather than our environment. When you look at clocks, so it seems that the more accurately we measure time, the less of it we feel that we have. We're always rushing around to meet different deadlines now, and that's contributing to a phenomenon that psychologists call time famine, where we always feel rushed and stressed, like we don't have enough time. Another area is in biological clocks. So we now know that when we become separated from the daily rhythms of the sun and the moon, that does actually have an impact on our psychological and mental health. So looking back over this long history of how we've changed our relationship with the sky and with the stars, we've built this wonderful scientific understanding of it, of physical reality out there. But for me, what really jumps out is that as we've relied more and more on objective measurements and calculations, we've also sidelined sort of our own experience. We no longer see that as really telling us anything that's important. And so I just wanted to finish by talking about one more example of where I think our personal connection with the sky is important, and that is with this idea of awe that I mentioned at the beginning. So the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, he tells a story about his first spacewalk. And he says that when he stepped out of the space station into sort of the emptiness of space, he was completely prepared for the mission that was ahead of him. And then he saw the Earth. And he said, I was attacked by raw beauty. It was stupefying. It stops your thought. And he talks about the universe, a sort of velvet bucket of stars stretching on forever in one direction. And then the other, he saw the Earth, this amazing kaleidoscope of color pouring by as the planet turned underneath him. And he said that what that experience taught him was that the power of the presence of the world as told to me by my ability to see it. I think the end part of that quote is important. And I think that's really sort of a beautiful quote about the importance of it not just being machines up there in space, but him actually there able to see the Earth. And this feeling of the sort of the beauty and the importance of the presence of the world, that's something that a lot of astronauts talk about. These technically trained, hard-headed people, they come back from space, and what they're talking about above all is the beauty and the fragility of the Earth and the importance of us looking after it and treating each other better. It has a name, the overview effect. But we can also get similar kinds of experiences down here on Earth when we look up at the stars, if we get a chance to see them. It's quite rare now that we see a truly dark sky, but when we do, it's absolutely mind-blowing. You feel lifted up, connected, and this experience has a name too. It's called celestial vaulting, this feeling of being lifted up to the stars, sort of connected with a bigger cosmos. And this is what psychologists are studying when they study the emotion of awe. And as I said at the beginning, it's got all of these benefits for our well-being. It changes people's perspective. They feel more connected. They're more generous. People make more ethical decisions. They care less about money and more about the planet. What's interesting is that people, after feeling awe, they also sign their names smaller. They estimate their own physical size as smaller. Brain scans show that brain activity that's normally associated with our sense of self is reduced. So all that's feeding into an idea of a sort of small self that's induced by awe, that being sort of in touch with a vast, bigger picture takes our focus away from ourselves, our selfish daily concerns that seem so important, and we just feel connected with this bigger picture, and that really profoundly changes how people feel and the kinds of decisions that they make. And the awe researchers, they warn of something that they call awe deprivation in modern society, this idea that we're all focused on small screens and we're not being confronted by the vast horizons of nature. And they warn that this is something that in modern society is making us more selfish and narcissistic. So, at the moment we've got all of these global challenges that we're facing, from the pandemic to climate change, and we're going to need science and a rational view of the world to understand those challenges, to come up with solutions. But I think the science is telling us that if we're going to make the decisions that we need to make to live peacefully and sustainably on this planet, then we are also going to need some awe. So just to conclude, we've now sort of built on what the Babylonians started. We've got this wonderful scientific understanding, this mathematical model of the universe. We've got our technology, our telescopes that can see further into space than our senses ever could. But I think now we need to rescue our personal experience of the stars, that direct connection with the sky. We hear a lot about the importance of our connection with nature, and I think we should include the stars in that, and that we should fight to keep our view of them. And that's because of their importance for our cultural heritage. As I've tried to show in this talk, our view of the starry sky is something that connects us with people all through history and all around the planet. It's something that's really shaped who we are, but also because that view, that connection with the bigger picture is still so important for how we live today. So thank you very much. That's the end of the talk. I'm just going to come out of my presentation.
Thank you so very much for the talk. Being a city girl, I can still remember the first time I saw a night full of stars, literally, in Maldives, and being in complete shock at its sheer beauty. I was also really impressed by the panorama view you gave in your talk, and all sorts of ways how people who came before us drew inspirations from looking at the stars. Okay, well, that's enough rambling from me. Let's have a look at the questions we picked up through the talk. Is there a way to quantify and compare the impact of clear night sky on our well-being compared to our other needs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because at the moment we need lighting, we need satellites in the sky. There are all sorts of things that are sort of taking away our view of the sky. And it's all for good reasons. We want to be able to see at night. We want to have these satellites. So these are, I'm talking about the Elon Musk's, all these little satellites that are being sent up into the sky that are for global sort of internet coverage. But at the same time, the worry is that there's actually going to be more of those soon than actual stars. They're going to sort of obliterate our view of the stars. So there's good reasons why we want this technology. And I think the worry at the moment is that our need to see the sky is not being taken into account at all. So we have a sort of economic arguments about companies developing their technology. We need to be able to sort of see at night to reduce crime and that kind of thing. We need, reduce road accidents. And those are all really important things, but we're not actually balancing that against the need to see the sky. And I think that is precisely because it's harder to quantify that. It's harder to make a sort of direct economic argument. But I think we need to find ways of doing that. And I think maybe there's some of these studies on awe, which can show those psychological benefits, might help towards doing that so that we can reach a better balance. At the moment, if you want to switch lights on or you want to send satellites into the sky, there's absolutely nothing about the view that will stop you from doing that. So I think it's a really good question, and that is something that we're going to have to find a way to do.
Well, I mean, coming from a biomedical sciences background, I know how notoriously difficult is it to quantify things in psychology. So I think the main point here is that we should really take it into account. And right now, people are not focusing on it pretty much at all. And any more improvement we can make will be somewhat better than where we are now. So maybe have the next question.
General bias, I think, against we don't take into account things that are harder to measure. And so this move to objective measurement and data is been really useful, but it means that we do miss stuff. So my last book, Cure, was about medicine and the importance of our psychological state, for our physical bodies. And that's something that's been really missed in medicine because it is harder to measure. And yet our mental state, our hope, expectation, belief is really important for determining how we do physically. So I think it's part of this deeper issue that we don't take things that can't be measured and counted seriously. So we know there needs to be a deeper shift there. But actually, with light pollution, it's actually quite easy. So the one good thing about light pollution, so scientists have said that it's so serious for wildlife as well that it should be seen as a global threat on a par with climate change. That is how serious people are taking it. But the good thing about it is you can reverse it instantly. You can switch off the lights and it's gone. It's not like pollution or climate change. So this is something that we could really do something about. And actually, if you use more efficient lighting, if you use lighting that's shielded so that the light's not going up, it's only going down, there isn't really any downside to that. So there's actually a very small cost to reducing light pollution, and really great benefits. So it's just hasn't really been on people's radar. And I think it's partly as well because we've forgotten how amazing the sky is. Like my kids have never seen a properly dark sky, and that really breaks my heart that they haven't. And so I think when we forget what was there, there isn't the will to change it. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping to do with this book, is to remind people what an incredible sight this is and how important it's been and how we really do need to sort of fight to try and save it.
Indeed, we should be grateful that we do have such a beautiful night sky out there for us to see. May we have the next question, please? I know there are quite a few of them. Is there any relationship between this human cosmos and cosmic rays?
I do talk about, so obviously we have cosmic rays that are reaching us from the rest of the universe, and these are sort of particles that are striking, and they can have biological effects and electromagnetic effects. So yeah, they're absolutely part of the sort of connection that we have with the universe. But what I was trying to do with the book really, so more than looking at the physical effects, although I do have one chapter about biology and how all of the different sort of physical cues coming from the sky, whether that's the light, patterns of light and dark, electromagnetism, how those are affecting biology and including humans and our own bodies and our biological clocks much more fundamentally than we ever realized. And that's the moon as well as the sun. So I do talk about that. But overall, I'm interested in looking at the sort of the cultural importance. So what did looking at the sky mean to us, and how has that meaning changed, and how has that view sort of really shaped different aspects of our civilization?
Wow. We'll have the next question then in this case. Why do you think we separated ourselves from the universe around us? And why are we not so bothered about it anymore?
Yeah, this is a question that really fascinates me. So it was really the sort of the theme that came out of the book. I just started initially wanting to tell the story of the heavens. How have different people seen the heavens? How has that changed? But the thing that really came out was this separation. So we think about, we've built a scientific understanding, and that has connected us to the cosmos in lots of ways. We can see so far, we understand so much about the universe. We've got this technology, we can now go into space. So it is connecting us in one way, but I couldn't help being struck by what we're losing, and that we have really sidelined or downgraded the importance of our own view. We don't see our own view of the stars as really telling us anything particularly important. And I think it's been a very gradual thing. As they tried to show, it's happened really over millennia. And I think it's because a mathematical approach is so powerful. It's so, you predict so exquisitely, accurately what's going to happen in the physical world out there, and we can use that to build technology. We can use that to make money as well. Technology is all driven up with sort of connected with economic development. So it's just a very persuasive, compelling way of thinking. But I think what's happened is, because science is so powerful and effective, we've almost started seeing that as all there is. Like, that's the only way of looking at the world, that what we count and measure is all that's important. And it's actually quite easy to count and measure. And so we've sort of stopped looking at all of those things that are harder to count and measure. And what I was trying to do in Cure, as well as this book, is to sort of say, actually, that stuff's important. We tend to end up with this sort of split where there's the world of science and it's rigorous and full of skeptics, and anything that's not quantitative or objective data just needs to be thrown out. And anyone who doesn't agree is, I don't know, pseudoscientific or flaky or whatever. And then on the other side, you've got the more alternative mindset where they're sort of quite distrustful of science, and it's all about personal beliefs and experiences, and you have a lot of magical thinking and really not paying attention to evidence. And I think both of those extremes are unhelpful. I think we need to have a sort of middle road where, yes, there's a physical world out there and evidence is really, really important. Like, we really need science to know what's going on. We must never let go of that. But the measurements and the numbers don't tell us everything. There is so much more that's important. And actually, when we start to take that seriously, there are ways of measuring, in a way, taking into account these more ephemeral things. At the moment, we just measure how well a country is doing by its GDP, for example, just this number, which doesn't take account of well-being or environmental resources or any of these things. It's a kind of it's just been taken on because it's easy. It's just one number that you can count. But what happens is that then starts changing policy, and everyone starts looking at that one number, and all the things that number doesn't encompass get forgotten. So sorry, I'm going on for quite a long time, but I think it's a really good question and really fundamental of this, how compelling and easy it is just to look at the numbers. And we have to be aware of the sort of bigger picture. We're not computers or machines. We are human beings, conscious, aware, feeling human beings. As Chris Hadfield sort of said when he's looking down on the earth, the power of the presence of the world is told to me by my ability to see it. That applies to us as well. Like, we see, we experience, we feel, our lives and our reality. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. I think I definitely echo your point, being that some things just get forgotten on the way as our science and technology develops. For example, there's the Rachel Carson's book on the Silent Spring that came out in 1960s, and that was the start of the environmentalist movement. And for a long time, we just forgot about, there was an environment that we need to protect out there. And I think it's a very similar situation here, that, there is a night sky that we all would like to see, and it actually does us good to be able to see it. Maybe for the next question, please. What is the biggest obstacle in promoting clear and dark night skies?
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously there are dark skies campaigns out there and dark skies reserves that you can visit. So there are people fighting for this, and things that are happening. I think there was a parliamentary review in this country recently on dark skies. But I think there's a couple of things. I think one is just this cultural amnesia, that we've forgotten what there was, because we so rarely see a proper dark sky, and a lot of people never have seen it. It's been so wiped away, and even a lot of us in our childhoods won't have seen a proper dark sky. I think there's just we've forgotten or never knew how amazing this view is. I think people who have experienced that tend to be a lot more passionate about fighting for dark skies. And then there is so much else now to take our attention, on our screens. Everything's like, there's so much sort of entertainment and social media, it's very compelling, and all being designed by technological companies to be as addictive as possible. It's they're getting very, very good at drawing our attention, and it's hard to pull yourself away from that. But then there's also the fact that there isn't really anybody benefiting economically, I suppose, from giving us dark skies. So just the way that our whole system is set up, it's going to be companies making money out of technology. So the companies making our phones and our computers, or the electric lights, or the satellites, that's, our whole society is driven on economic development, right? So, and if there isn't a sort of economic or direct economic benefit from dark skies, then who is going to champion that? It's always going to be the bigger companies that have a lot more political power. So I think it's a combination probably of those two things.
Well, let's hope we see some developments in the future. Maybe the next question, please. What do you think the average person can do to contribute also to this cause?
Well, there's certainly, you can campaign for dark skies. Like, there are, lots of parks and petitions out there that would love to have support or donations. You can visit them. So there's that side of things. I think there's also just all of us in our lives, we can just try and be a bit more connected to the sky and the cosmos and sort of the bigger picture of our lives generally. So, I live in London. I don't get much of a chance to see a sort of panoramic night sky, but there, I still can see obviously the changing phases of the moon. Sort of you can follow that through the month. I really love seeing the changing position and phase of the moon and following those cycles. I can see bright star Sirius, for example, which really sparkles with this incredible rainbow light. It's absolutely gorgeous. Or you can see the planets as they're wandering. Quite often with the kids when they're walking home, we'll imagine that Venus is guiding us home, for example. I work in a loft, and in the mornings I can see the sunrise, and you can track sort of day by day through the year how the position of sunrise on the landscape is changing through the seasons. And then just before Christmas, there's a point at which it goes around the corner and I can't see it for the winter. But then in the spring, like it just happened a couple of weeks ago, the sunrise comes back again. And so that makes me feel much more connected with the cycles through the year. So there's that kind of thing. And also I think just a more general point of not always just being sucked into small screens and social media and those easy sort of small dopamine hits, and to realize that we know this anyway, but there is a real cost to that, and that we need to put that down sometimes, put the technology down, and just get out there in nature without tweeting it or putting it on Instagram, but just not trying to express things in words or think about it rationally, but just enjoy that sort of thought stopping, or when we're confronted with these big horizons of nature.
That's definitely some advice I can take on. I should definitely go outside more, even though I'm probably in the middle of a city, Oxford that is. But okay.
The nice thing about the lockdown that a lot of us haven't been able to travel very far from where we live, but the sky is still this terrain that we can explore.
Indeed. We'll have two more questions and then we'll probably have to call it a night. Right, move to the next question, please. What are the most interesting facts that you discovered while researching for your book?
Oh, that's a big question. Obviously, I would say that they were all interesting, and I've tried to put quite a few of them into the talk for you tonight. Some of the things that I didn't talk about, there's a chapter on religion, for example. So I look at the birth of Christianity, so the kind of move from sort of worship of sky gods, which a lot of societies had very early on. So pretty much every society, the sky is very important in faith and religious belief. So the move from seeing gods in the sky to sort of monotheistic religions where there's a more sort of one transcendent God. And if you look at the birth of Christianity, you see how beliefs sort of about sun worship were really, particularly the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century AD, he was very instrumental in making Christianity the dominant religion in the Roman world, and that's really the reason why Christianity is so powerful now. But he really kind of melded this sort of more pagan sun worship with Christianity. You've got Sunday as a day of worship, praying to the east, in the direction in which the sun rises. You've got Christmas just after the winter solstice, Easter just after the spring equinox. So this sort of Jesus' story is kind of mirroring that annual cycle of the sun. So all of these things were sort of taken on by Christianity, and that really helped people to sort of convert, because they didn't really have to give up any of their old beliefs or rituals. They could just keep doing them in this new name. And I think that's just we think we've moved on from sort of sky worship, but actually a lot of that is still with us. Something else that's interesting about that is that I talked about the Babylonians and their mathematics and their astronomy, and how we've, a lot of that's still important for us now. But then if you look at the ancient Egyptians, their astronomy wasn't as developed as the Babylonians was. But their ideas about souls and going up to the sky, the heavens after death, the idea about the pharaoh, he could travel up on the sun's rays and become one with either the sun or the circumpolar stars, and that there were spells that helped him to do this, and that later got expanded so other people could do that as well. It's thought that those ideas were really influential among the ancient Greeks in inspiring ideas about how we have a soul that goes up to heaven after we die. That's not something you see in Judaism or the Old Testament of the Bible. That's something that really comes through from the Greeks. So this idea that seems so fundamental now, that our souls go up to heaven, that may be directly descended from these ideas of the old Egyptian pharaohs, which I think is fascinating. There are also chapters about art, for example. So yeah, I haven't really got time to go through all of it, but there's lots of things that I don't have time to talk about
I
tonight.
can definitely tell you're very passionate about what you're writing about. I haven't noticed that Sunday actually contained the word sun, and it actually comes from, the sun that we see every day. But that's my one fact of the day, I guess. We'll have one last question, and I'm afraid I will have to end it there. Where can you see a good reconstruction of a clock like the one Richard of Wallingford had?
You could actually go to St Albans. So there's a museum there, and one of the images that I showed was from that museum. And as far as I know, the reconstruction is still there.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we're going to have time for. If you're interested, please make sure you check out Dr. Marchant's book. Thank you again to our speaker for taking her time to come and deliver this talk. I will quote one of our audience members and say, "Thank you for such an enlightening webinar." We'll appreciate the pun here. Thank you goes to our audience today. We're more than glad to have your attention. Thank you to our members for your support, and our committee members for taking care of all aspects of the journey of the society. Next week, our Vice President, Carlos, will be hosting the last event of this term, where Oxford's own Dr. Anna Domingos will be talking about metabolism and neuroimmunology. We hope to see you there. If you have a lovely Easter vacation, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.